Welcome to EPG Pathsala for Comparative Literature. I am Dr. Porosmoni Doctor, Assistant Professor of Cultural Studies in Tezpur University. Today I will take up the module Folk Culture, which is a part of the course Comparative Literature and Culture. In ordinary uses, the phrase folk culture refers to cultural forms and practices having certain characteristics. For example, it is believed that folk cultures are artistic and creative practices of a relatively homogeneous and identifiable group, often belonging to rural locations. They are also understood to be the relics of the bygone times, handed down orally from generation to generation. As a result of such presuppositions, folk cultures are thought to be the residual cultural elements of the past, still surviving in the practices of the rural folk. The reason for such kind of perception about folk culture can be attributed to the early collectors and researchers of folk cultural materials in the 19th century Europe. In those thoughts and works of the early folklore scholars, the folk were thought to be peasants, the illiterate masses in a literate society. However, modern scholarship of folk cultural studies has now negated these essentialist presuppositions that folk culture has to be oral and rural always. They have been documenting convincingly that folk cultural practices are also present in the modern non-rural and non-oral forms and transmissions. They do exist as heterogeneous, live and emergent practices. The term used by international researchers and practitioners in the academic field is folklore, which includes all the manifestations of folk cultural practices, including material as well as non-material cultural categories. Noted folklorist of late 20th century, Alan Dundes, defined folklore by dividing the word into two constituent parts, folk and lore. He explained that a folk is any group of people whatsoever who share at least one common linking factor. It doesn't matter what that linking factor is. It could be nationality, ethnicity, religion, occupation, kinship, or any similar factor. Dundes explains the second constituent part of the term lore in the following words. Lore refers to several hundred forms or genres. Folklore genres include epic, myth, folktale, legend, folk song, proverb, riddle, folk dance, superstition, games, gestures, foodways, folk costumes, and many, many more. All folklore, no matter what genre, will exhibit multiple existence, meaning that an item will exist in more than one time and space. Moreover, as a result of the transmission process from person to person, there will inevitably be variation. No two versions will be exactly the same. The presence of multiple existence and variation distinguishes folklore from so-called high culture and also from mass and popular culture. These two features, multiple existence and variation of folk cultural items, are particularly important in making sense of the folk culture in contrast to other categories like mass culture, popular culture, or high culture. The notion of multiple existence refers to the fact that folk cultural items demonstrate more than one occurrence in time and space. For example, in contrast to the singular occurrence of a literary novel, which gets written at a particular time, in a particular place, by a particular author, the occurrence and existence of a folk epic spreads across bounded historical times and geographic locations. Further, the literary novels usually exist in one person. By contrast, folk narratives, tales, legends, jokes, etc. do not conform to any such singular authoritative version. They demonstrate variations. Regarding the obsession with orality in the common presuppositions about folk culture, Dundes further clarifies that most folklore is transmitted orally or by example gestures. But some folklore is written, for example, autograph, book verse, epitaphs, latrinalia, which means bathroom wall writings, etc. These literatures do manifest multiple existence and variation and therefore qualify as bona fide folklore. This interpretation not only testifies that folk culture exists beyond the oral mode of transmission, but these illustrations also stand for modern folklorist understanding of folk culture as something that keeps on existing as a very much imagined part. This interpretation not only testifies that folk culture exists beyond the oral mode of transmission, but these illustrations also stand for modern folklorist understanding of folk culture as something that keeps on existing as very much an imagined part within the changing ways of modern industrial life. In order to facilitate a systematic approach towards the study of the bewildering varieties of folk cultural resources, Richard M. Dawson, the pioneer of academic study of folk culture in late 20th century, put forward a fourfold classification of the materials of folk culture. These four broad categories are oral literature, material culture, social folk custom, and performing folk arts. International folkloristics of current times seems to follow these fourfold schemes for the fields of folk culture. However, Dawson cautioned that these four divisions are not all-inclusive or mutually exclusive. Categories are primarily to facilitate analytical treatments, whereas folk cultural materials in the real-life experiences do exhibit substantial overlapping of the categorical boundaries. Now we will discuss some of the characteristics of the first category called oral literature. The oral literature, which is also referred by different authors as verbal art or folk literature, includes those folk cultural items which are The oral literature, which is also referred by different authors as verbal art or folk literature, includes those folk cultural items which are articulated through spoken or sung expressions. It includes a number of further subcategories such as folk narrative, folk song, and folk speech. Folk narrative embraces a variety of oral prose genres like myths, legend, tale, joke, anecdote, saga, romance, any other items which may exist as local genres in specific cultural contexts. The lyrical contents of various types of folk songs can be placed within oral literature, whereas the performative dimensions of singing and listening folk songs are more apt to be discussed under the division performing folk arts. The folk speech refers to those informal modes of interaction or self-expression, distinct from the formal and standard speech acts. Proverb, riddle, tongue twister, blessings and curses, insult, gossips are some of the well-known genres of folk speech. Material culture. If oral literature is the oral part of folk culture, material culture or physical folk life stands for the visible part of it. It refers to the material objects created and used in traditional ways. Folk arts and crafts, costumes, foods, architecture, domestic implements, and all other folk cultural resources that involve material and visible objects can be placed within the division of material culture. Material culture, as observed by Dawson, responds to techniques, skills, recipes, and formulas transmitted across the generation and subject to the same forces of conservative tradition and individual variation as verbal art. Material culture Material cultural items can be distinguished among other cultural forms by their tangible substantiality and relative imperishability. Most of the material cultural resources are uniquely detachable from their contexts of production and use, are thus eminently collectible. The emergence and expansion of the virtual world and cyberculture in recent times have opened up new scopes for academic engagements with the new intersection of the material and digital technology. The third category of folk culture, which is social folk customs, includes community and family observances that may include various sites of social interactions and events of the rites of passages like birth, initiation, date, etc. Here the emphasis is on group interaction rather than on individual skills and performances. Festivals, celebrations, games, recreations, folk medicine, folk religion are some of the prominent sites of group interaction which draw attention of the folklorist. These customs are often closely bound up with deeply held folk beliefs, which in themselves constitute folk genre. When the aesthetic dimensions are foregrounded, many of these events and activities come under the shadow of performing folk arts. The fourth category, performing folk art, deals with the various types of folk music, folk dance, and folk drama. As mentioned earlier, certain aspects of these genres may belong to any of the other three dimensions of folk culture. For example, the lyrical text of a song or the script of a folk drama can be a subject of oral literature. The enactment of a folk play may carry with its ritualistic dimensions. Of social folk custom, musical instruments used in a particular performance of music are part of the material culture. Moreover, the artistic and aesthetic qualifiers of these activities on the basis of which they are to be judged are non. Moreover, the artistic and aesthetic qualifiers of these activities on the basis of which they are to be judged as art or non-art always context sensitive. The academic study of folk culture had been enriched with different sets of theoretical frameworks and interpretations. Some of such important theoretical legacies in the field of folk cultural traditions are comparative folklore theory, national folklore theory, anthropological folklore theory, psychoanalytical folklore theory, and structural folklore theory. We will pick up the first theoretical legacy, which we called comparative folklore theory. The root of comparative exercise with folklore materials can be traced back to the German collectors in the early 19th century, especially Grimm brothers, who collected and published folk tales, which they studied through comparative analysis to trace the root of the German language. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, folklorists in Finland devised and applied a rigorous method of comparing various types of and variants and versions of folk tales, aiming to reconstruct the earliest version of a tale. This method aimed at not only reconstructing the history of a complex folk tale, but also at tracing the geographical route through which the tale had traveled from its source of origin to the place in question. Because of this, the method was known as Finnish historical geographical method. Some of the important contributors of this method were Antti Aarn and Stitt Thomsen, who started and expanded the European Tale Type Index. Archer Taylor was another champion of this comparative explanatory. Archer Taylor was another champion of this comparative exploratory method. He applied the method in studying the history of proverbs. This method was, however, criticized due to its several hypothetical flaws and exhaustive technicalities involved. Dorsen commented that the comparative folklorist of Finnish has diverted attention of the philosophical and metaphysical questions of folklore. Dorsen commented that the comparative folklorist of the Finnish has diverted attention from philosophical and metaphysical questions of meaning to empirical questions of fact. However, the Finnish comparative school contributed a number of fundamental conceptual tools for dealing with formal contents of folk cultural items, especially folk tales. The second theoretical set of ideas can be called national folklore theory. During the age of nationalism in 20th century, folk cultural resources and their academic studies began to be influenced by political forces of nationalism in respective countries. While the comparative approach stressed on the unities of common themes of folklore materials across national boundaries, the nationalistic approach, on the other hand, emphasized on the distinct qualities of folk cultures within their respective national geographies. In Finland and Ireland, the assertion of cultural independence was carried on through passionate revival of original tongue and rigorous collection and compilation of oral literary specimens. Hitler's Germany was the first nation state to make political capital of folk cultural studies. Nazi Germany exploited folklorists to put forward the ideology of a mass race. Nazi Germany exploited folklorists to put forward the ideology of a master race, united through mystical bonds of blood and culture, including folk culture. In Soviet Russia, folklore scholarship was made to fall in line with the party ideology of working class. The use of folk culture as an effective tool for national propaganda and the control and appropriation of folk cultural scholarship as a part of the nation-building strategy became a common phenomenon to all the independent and aspiring to be independent nations in 20th century. In the context of India, the spirit of nationalism gave birth to the native scholarship of Indian folk culture. Prior to that, it was mostly the Christian missionaries and collectors of the colonial government who carried out the task of collecting and documenting Indian folk cultural materials in their own ways. Anthropological folklore theory. The next set of theoretical scholarship in folk culture is anthropological theories. The anthropological school of folktale studies is typically characterized by their interpretation of folk cultural materials in relation to the wider cultural ethos of a community. The anthropological school of folklore studies is typically characterized by their interpretation of folk cultural materials in relation to the wider cultural ethos of a community. The American anthropologist of mid-20th century, namely Franz Boas, and his student and able successor Ruth Benedict, were particularly known for studying oral cultural materials in the non-literate societies. Boas, in his Chimchian mythology, laid down the proposition that traditional tales mirror the material cultural traits. Therefore, tales comprise ethnography and provide valuable clues to the lost elements of community history. He also contributed to the diffusion theory of tales and other narratives by illustrating that tales and other narratives get transmitted from one group to another contiguous group during the times of cultural contact. He also contributed to the diffusion theory of tales and other narratives by illustrating that tales and other narratives get transmitted from one group to another contiguous group during the times of cultural contact. Critics of Boas, however, point out that his works lacked attention to the latent meaning in oral cultural content. Ruth Benedict, in her Junie mythology, took the path opposite to what Boas had taken. Instead of looking at how much the textual content of tale tallies with the material world of a group, she emphasized on the points of divergence. Taking into account the apparent discrepancies between the tale content and the cultural content of a group, Benedict gave a Freudian interpretation that suppressed tensions in a society are released and made manifest in oral literature. Calling attention to the different styles of individual narrators that led to existence of multiple variants of narrative, Benedict differentiated individual style from tribal style. According to Benedict, the narrator applies his creative talent in celebrating. According to Benedict, the narrator applies his creative talent in elaborating and choosing optional episodes in a tale, and his skill over the traditional repertoire. But his creative exercise is restricted within the linguistic structure and the native themes and formulas. Another anthropological folklorist, William Bascom, coined the phrase vowel art for folk literature. This terminological replacement was intended to wipe out some anthropologist tendency to accept myths, tales, proverbs, and riddles not as folklore but as ethnographic data. With this new terminology as vowel art, Bascom emphasized the anthropological necessity to value the creative compositions of a living community, which should be viewed as dynamic, not static, integrated, not isolated, central, not peripheral components of the culture. Bascom is also remembered for his explanation on the functional roles of folk cultural materials in a society. For example, proverbs help settle legal decisions, riddles sharpen wits, myths validate conduct, satirical songs release pent-up hostilities. A tale is not dictated text with interlinear translation, but a living recitation delivered to a responsive audience. For such cultural purposes like reinforcement of custom and taboo, release of aggressions through fantasy, pedagogical explanations of the natural world, and applications of pressures for conventional behavior. Bascom's approach calls for attention not merely to the text of oral literature, but to its contextual details as well, which a comparative folklorist should invest in relating folk cultural practices with the wider cultural world of a community. Melville Jacobs was a comparative folklorist who worked on and advanced Franz Boas' notion of folklore as the mirror of culture. Jacobs illustrated how the animal character in certain community tales actually stand for human characters, a point missed by Boas. Improvising the theory of reflective character of folk cultural elements, Jacobs put forward that oral literature does not mirror the external life, but projects the internal stresses and anxieties of people. Our next set of theoretical perspectives is called psychoanalytical folklore theory. Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud was responsible for establishing of what can be called the psychoanalytical school in folk cultural studies, where the myths and tales are regarded as the symbolic manifestations of the suppressed sexual desires in human minds. In his interpretation of dreams, Freud treated dreams as a reflection of the latent repressed wishes and fears of infantile sexuality in covert and symbolic forms. Like the dreams experienced at individual level, the myths are similar to dreams, but are experienced at the collective level. Karl Abraham, a champion of Freudian approach who wrote Dreams and Myths, famously wrote, "The dream is the myth of the individual," which leads to the later paraphrasing as, "Myths are institutionalized dreams." The psychoanalytical theories are known for their reading of the objects and actions in a tale or a myth as the sexual symbols. Referring to Erich Fromm, a later exponent of the psychoanalytical theories, Dawson summarized the typical deployment of sexual symbolism in psychoanalytic reading of oral texts. The male genital is symbolized by sticks, trees, umbrellas, knives, pencils, hammers, airplanes. The female genital is represented in the same manner by caves, bottles, boxes, doors, jewel cases, gardens, flowers. Dreams or fairy tales about dancing, riding, climbing, and flying signify sexual enjoyment. Hair falling out symbolizes castration. Ernest Jones, Eric Fromm, and Geza Roheim were the prominent names who interpreted oral literary materials with Freudian psychoanalytic theory. Carl J. Jung, who was a student of Freud, established his own distinct school of psychoanalytic theory. Despite the distinction of Jung's psychoanalysis from Freud's, Darshan opines that both have much in common as far as their dealing with folklore materials is concerned. According to Darshan, both Freud and Jung interpreted myths and fairy tales by the method of symbolism. The Freudian pairs of opposites, male, female, phallus, vagina, recur in Jung in metaphysical rather than nakedly sexual terms like conscious, unconscious, life, death, God, Satan. Both schemes of interpretation employ the key concept of the unconscious, transferred by Jung from the individual to the race. Jung, as well as Freud, equates myths and fairy tales with dreams and psychotic fantasies. Despite the initial reservations of many folklorists towards the psychoanalytical school that involves reading of oral literary materials in terms of excessive sexual imagery, anthropological folklorists gradually began to apply psychoanalytical concepts in interpreting their various ethnographic experiences. Melville Haskowitz, for example, used Freudian ideas for interpreting family structure and interpersonal equations in family. Our last theoretical category is structural theories in folk culture. The structural theories of folk cultural studies started with the works of the Russian formalist Vidya-mitra, whose book was translated into English as Morphology of the Folktale in 1958. However, Proff's original book in Russian language was published in 1928, 3 decades before. The historical novelty in Proff's work was that, unlike his preceding folklorist's emphasis in tracing the origin of a tale or finding the meaning of a folktale, Proff chose the systematic description of all folktales as structures which comprised of and reducible to limited numbers of structures. The historical novelty of Proff's work was that, unlike his preceding folklorist's emphasis in tracing the origin of a tale or getting the meaning of a narrative, Proff chose the systematic description of all folk tales as structures which are comprised of and reducible to limited numbers of structural components, which he called functions. For example, abstination is a function which involves a situation of the sudden absence or disappearance of someone from the family. Similarly, interdiction is another function that involves a warning given to the hero or the heroine not to do certain things. In this way, Propp identified 31 functions in his collection of Russian folktales. These functions are the constant elements in the tales which do not change, like the variables which change from one tale to another. These functions are limited in number, and any folktale is a linear sequence of some of such functions. Propp opined that these 31 functions are accountable for all the folktales of the world. This means any folktale structurally will be a sequence of some of these 31 functions identified by Propp. French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss established another influential school of structural study of the folk cultural resources. However, unlike Propp's However, unlike Prof's deliberate detachment with the content of a folk tale and his emphasis solely on the form, the instructional theory of Levi-Strauss is concerned with both the structural form and contents or meaning of a narrative. In his highly influential article, Structural Study of Meat, Levi-Strauss treated meat as a higher level of communication, which is somewhat similar to language. Borrowing the conceptual tools from the Ferdinand socio-structural linguistics, such as binary oppositions, arbitrary signs, synchronic and diachronic categories, aspects of language, Levi-Strauss reduced mythical narratives into units called meetings. However, unlike Prof's functions, which are ordered in linear or syntagmatic sequence, Levi-Strauss meetings are ordered in nonlinear paradigmatic sequences. Pairs of meetings, when arranged in a particular order, are seen to form binary oppositional units. At the end of the complex interpretation of Levi-Strauss, a meat would become a cognitive instrument of thought for the primitive people, which involves contradictions and binary oppositions, and which is used by primitive people to confront with their contradictory thoughts and experiences in real life. A later structural approach in folklore was devised by Milman Parry and Albert Lord in their work of Slavic oral poetry. Borrowing the notion of formulaic character of classical epics, Parry and Lord in their book Singer of Tales explored the key compositions and structures of epics, ballads, romances, and tales in their narrative performances. Parry and Lord pointed out that the narrators and performers of such genres deploy specific formulas, which are made up of melodic, metric, syntactic, and acoustic patterns. These formulas are used for memorization and improvisation of such narrative roots. These formulas are used for memorization and improvisation of such narrative texts by their respective performers. Parry and Lord's theory is known as oral formulaic theory. Having discussed this range of theoretical legacies in folk cultural studies, now I would like to conclude with the fact that in contemporary times, the field of folk cultural studies has been enriched by increasing number of interdisciplinary perspectives. The influence of post-structuralism and postmodernism has resulted in diverse academic perceptions and interests in folk cultural resources. One can refer to the feminist and post-colonial approaches, where folk cultural resources are explored and reinterpreted through critical feminist and indigenous readings. Empirical knowledge and theoretical perceptions in folk culture has been found useful also in alternative historiographies like oral history and people's history. On the political front, in one hand, folk cultural texts are either recreated or reinterpreted in favor of the desired ethnicities and identities of emerging groups, and on the other hand, folk cultural resources continue to be essential instruments of governance and nation building, where they are constantly being projected as the heritage of the insiders and spectacles for the outsiders. Thank you.